welcome back to my channel. This week I am making Anna's costume from Frozen to match my friend who is making the Elsa dress because she wanted matching costumes. Without any further ado, let me show you how I did it. Now I just want to say before I begin this project, I know that there is a simplicity version of this pattern and it's quite cheap to buy unless you live in New Zealand and look at the shipping cost, it's more than the actual pattern. Anyway. So for the first part of this project I'm tackling the bodice, and I'm using the bodice pattern in this book Self-Made Princess by Nikita. As you can see here, it comes with lots of different style options, but I'm using the one with straps, a sweetheart neckline and a lower waist. For the outer layer of the bodice I'm using this black mink fabric. For the interlining layers I'm using a black cotton drill, and for the lining fabric I couldn't go past this Elsa cotton. Now let us begin. So first I cut all the layers out of drill, which I intend to make a mock-up with first. Now because I'm feeling particularly lazy today and I'm pretty confident that the finished measurements of this bodice are going to fit me pretty well, this is my attempt at the mock-up. It is cut from one of the drill layers that I'll be interlining one of the other layers with, and I didn't even bother sewing it together because then I'd have to unpick it all again so I could baste it to one of the other layers. Instead, I've just pinned it, having it on the mannequin here. I'm pretty confident that I can go ahead and just unpin this all now and baste it to the outer layer and it should work. So I'm going to do that because it is going to take me a while to digitize the embroidery that goes on the front, and that's pretty much the reason why I'm doing the mock-up this way. So let's get it basted, and I think I'll construct the top layer and then I can get around to digitizing the embroidery. Next I cut the rest of the pieces out of the other fabric, starting with the mink first, and then I interline that mink with a layer of drill. After they've all been basted, I can now construct the bodice layer, and I do that by starting to sew the pattern pieces together on the front. And also a friendly reminder that everything you see me doing, I am simultaneously doing with the lining layer, such as basting it to some drill. Because the lining layer doesn't have any embroidery on it, I'm actually free to construct the entire thing as one piece rather than the front and back section like the outer layer. Speaking of, once all the pieces were sewn together, it was time to create boning channels. Now to do that, I'm just sewing along all of the seams using a black cotton twill tape. I sew as close as I can to the edge down both sides, thus creating a boning channel. For the bones themselves, I'm using spiral steel and then one flat steel in the front and two on either end. As fate would have it for this project, I was out of end caps and so was my local supplier, and that's when I found out you can use heat shrink electrical tape. Is it a tape? I have no idea. Anyway, I just put that on the ends, ran it through a candle flame, trimmed it up a bit, and it worked just as good as any boning end cap. I then put all of the bones into the channel, and now it was time to work on those outer layers again, so I digitized the embroidery and began stitching it out on the front and back pieces. After all the embroidery was done, it was now time to assemble the front and back pieces together. I did this by sewing them together at the side seams and the shoulder seams. Next, with right sides together, it was time to attach the outer layer to the lining layer down this back seam here. Then after turning it right side out, it was time to attach a gold trim along the top and bottom edges, so I sewed it along the top first using my machine. Then as luck would have it, I forgot to film the part where I turned it over to the inside and then hand stitched the entire length down. Oh well, time for eyelets. Using this cool new hole punch that I found at the second-hand store, I was able to punch all of the holes out for the eyelets and then hammer the eyelets in place. And with that done, so is the bodice. So let's move on to making the skirt. Initially I started with this Bodice pattern, number 6342, and some blue fabric, but in the end that turns out not to be relevant, and I'll show you why eventually. Okay, so something to note on the pattern piece here is that the pleat in the top of the skirt calls for it to pleat like that, just a single knife pleat, right, running down that way. However, looking at the photos on Anna's costume, hers appears to be a box pleat, so instead of pleating it the way that they want, all I'm going to be doing is taking this one to the center of this point here, and then this piece here, meeting it in the center as well, and that should give us the box pleat, and I'll trim that back once I go to put the waistband in. So yeah, that's the alteration that I'm making to this pattern piece. Super simple. So the next step, of course, is cutting out the pattern pieces from the fabric. Alright, so I have the skirt panels cut and pinned to the mannequin with the little box pleats at the top. All I have to do now is to add the scalloped part along the bottom edge of the skirt. And to do that, I'm going to consult the original pattern piece and using maths, figure out how to evenly space those scallops along the bottom edge. And as luck would have it, I found this perfect blue fabric at the op shop to do the scallops in. And it was all of $2, so this is what I'll be using here. And let's go do some maths and figure out how to do the scallops. So here I'm using a protractor and drawing in evenly spaced scallop edges directly onto the bottom of the pattern piece because I'm feral. That's the only explanation for that here. Next I cut it out of that lovely blue fabric using my rotary cutter so that I can make those points nice and crisp. Then I place it along the bottom edge of my skirt, wrong sides together first, so that I can sew the bottom edge together, even though I was pointing to the scallops there. Now the reason I sew that bottom edge first is I'm actually creating an enclosed hem, so when I flip it over to the right side, you won't see any of those raw edges. And to make that look even neater, I also do some understitching so that none of the dark fabric will show through where the light fabric is along the bottom edge. Next, I turn the fabric right side out and using a very tight zigzag stitch known as a satin stitch, I finish that scalloped edge. I remade the skirt. Turns out I wasn't happy with the fullness at the bottom part of the skirt with the one that I've just made using that pattern, so I went and got new fabric and I made it using a circle skirt, and I'm so much happier with it now because it's completely full down the bottom. But that does bring me around to another issue that I'm having. So I went and got felted wool to make the skirt from, and when I was in the shop I got two colours that I thought were blue. Let me insert a photo here of what they look like in the shop. Right, they're both shades of blue. And then I get it home and it turns out one of them is actually green, so that sucks. To remedy that, I went and brought some fabric paints and I'm just going to paint that bottom layer with the fabric paint because I searched through all of their wool they had there and that one was the closest I could find, and yeah, well, it's green. Anyway, so I'm remaking the skirt now using a circle skirt. I'm also going to give it pockets. You guys have seen me do that 1,000 times. And I'll come back to you when it's ready for embroidery. So first things first, I cut out 2 half circles of the blue felted wool. And then I cut the scallops out of that slightly green fabric. And I made the pattern piece the exact same way as I made the one for the skirt that I didn't end up using. So that's how that was done. I lay the scallops directly on top of the right side of the blue fabric, and using an invisible thread and a long stitch, I top stitched it all down in place. And here's how it looked after I was done. So the next step here is to add some pockets. Using my favourite pocket pattern, I cut the pieces out of some blue cotton from my stash. And then I sew those pieces into the side seams of my skirt. With all the pocket pieces sewn in, I can now sew the 2 sides of the skirt together. After the skirt pieces were sewn together, I added a 2-inch waistband along the top, a zipper in the back, the embroidery along the bottom, and here's how it looks. For the pattern, I'm using McCall's M7360 as the base. For the fabric, I'm using this light blue, kinda teal cotton. And for the decorative trim, I'm using this teal ribbon. First, I cut out all of the pattern pieces. And then I iron on a fusible interfacing to the cuff and collar pieces. Then I sew in the darts. And then I prepare the front placket. First I add the interfacing and then I iron over the seam allowance on one side of it. Next I sew in both sides of the placket to the centre front of the top. Then I cut all the way down the centre line. Next I fold the placket pieces over, encasing that raw edge, and hand stitch them to the inside of the shirt. Now it's time to add the trim. So my ribbon wasn't dark enough, in fact it was the exact same colour as the shirt, so I use a Copic marker here to colour it a little bit darker. And then I sewed it directly to the front of the shirt. Then on either side of the ribbon I used one of the fancy stitches on my machine to finish off the decoration. Now it's time to work on the back of the shirt, so here I make some pleats in the back. And then I sew a yoke across the top edge. Then I sew the inside yoke along the inside of the shirt. Then I sew the front and back pieces of the shirt together at the shoulder seams, making sure to only sew them to the outside yoke piece. Then I hand sew the inside yoke piece, making sure to encase all of the raw edges. Now I can sew together the side seams. Next it's time to prep the sleeve pieces, so to do that I add some gathering stitches along the bottom edge of the sleeve where the cuff will go. Then I sew in the under sleeve piece along this side here. After finishing the bottom edge of the sleeve so that it looks like this, it's now time to sew the other part of the under sleeve to the side. And now it's time for the cuffs, so I add a decorative trim just as I did to the front placket. Ta-da! And now it's time to sew the cuffs to the bottom of the sleeves. Next I fold the cuffs over and sew down the side seams here. And to finish the cuffs I do even more hand sewing, so I encase the raw edge of the bottom of the cuff in the sleeve and I sew it to the inside of the sleeve. Finally for the cuffs it's time to add some buttons. Good morning, it's a new morning and as you can see I've got the sleeves on the shirt finally. All that's left to do now is to put a collar on it, and how I'm going to do that is I'm taking the collar piece, this mandarin collar here from my favourite mandarin collar pattern, which is Butterick B6483, and we're going to splice it onto this top. So that's what I'm going to do right now. Join me. First I cut the collar piece out of both interfacing and cotton, and after applying the interfacing I do the decorative trim along the edge just as I've done with the cuffs in the front placket. Once it's finished, I then sew the two collar pieces together along this edge here. Then I sew the collar to the shirt by machine first, and then you guessed it, there's more hand sewing to sew it to the inside. And here is the finished shirt, and I forgot to film it, but the front placket closes with invisible snaps. For the cape pattern, I'm using this off-brand McCall's pattern, number M7000. For the fabric, I'm using this pink wool for the outside of the cape, and this berry satin for the lining. For the details, I'm using this white cotton pom-pom trim, which I'm going to dye with these two Rit dyes. And then this silver heart closure, which I wish was a fraction larger. So I found this hat at the secondhand store, and it's vintage and it's actual fur, so I'm going to harvest this for the fur that lines both the collar and her hat. And I don't mind doing it because it's got a massive tear in the top here which can't really be repaired, but I should be able to get some decent sized pieces out of this to repurpose for my costume. So the first things I do is cut the collar pieces out of the fur fabric using an X-Acto knife. And then I cut the rest of the cape pieces out of the fabric. Here I'm trying to figure out how to make the cape look a little bit more accurate. So out of the front piece, I'm trying to cut it down to this shape here, but I end up just doing away with the front piece altogether because her cape is all back. After all the fabric pieces have been cut out, I then dye some of the wool along with the pom-pom trim to get this awesome burgundy wine red colour. Next it's on to assembly, so I start with the smaller over cape first. Next I mark out where the pom-poms need to be sewn in, and I sew those to the cape, making sure that they're facing inward. Next I add a decorative zigzag stitch along the bottom edge of the cape, and I wish I had picked a cotton that was slightly darker. I thought this was dark enough, but it's not, you can barely see it. Then I sew the lining to this edge of the cape here. I also sew the lining to the under cape as well. After turning the under cape right way out, I also add a decorative zigzag stitch along the bottom edge, which once again I wish was darker. Then I baste the two layers of the cape together at the neckline. Now back to the collar piece, so using the darker wool that I dyed, I cut out this shape here and apply it to the normal pink shape here. Then I add the inside collar piece and sew it along the top edge here. And here's how that turned out. Now it's time to add it to the cape. Okay, as you can see here, I have sewn the collar on. Actually, I don't know if you can. This is so fluffy. And that is my point here. I added a fur collar trim on the inside, and it is entirely too much fluff poking out the top here. So on the actual reference of Anna, it looks like, you know, you can just see a tiny little bit of the white peeking out from there. And this, it just covers the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is take this bit out, and I'm going to use one of the offcuts that I have. It's just a tiny little strip of fur, and I'm going to try and sew that in a little bit lower on the collar so that you only see the little tiny bit. But other than that, the cape is done, and now I'm ready to paint the designs around the edges. So let's get on to that, shall we? Using a fabric paint that matches the same colour as the pom-pom trim, I hand paint all the design onto the cape, and this took forever. But after a few days I got it finished, and I love how it turned out. Finally, it's time for accessories, so I'm starting with some boots that I found at the thrift store. And the first thing I'm going to do to them is to change the heel colour to pink, just like Anna's. So I go in with a white leather base paint first. And then using this metallic pink paint, I then cover them. After they dry, it's time for the final embroidery part of this project. So I'm using 4 layers of a black tulle and a layer of water-soluble interfacing, and I hoop that up, getting it ready for my machine. And here it is, stitching out the design I created. And this is just your friendly reminder that all of these embroidery files will be available for free on my website, which is linked down below. This is how it looks when it's finished, and after I've cut away some of the water-soluble interfacing, and this is how it looks after I've washed it all off. Now it's time to attach it to the boot, which I do using some Yoo-Hoo glue. Finally, the last thing I wanted to make was her hat. So I'm using my head form here and some Glad wrap and some masking tape and just drawing out the shapes I wanted to create a pattern, which I then cut out of the same wool as the cape. Then I sew the two pieces together. Then using the dyed wool pieces, I cut out the trim. I then pin it to the cap and sew it in place. I then repeat that process with a slightly lighter dyed wool. Finally, I sew some of that leftover hat fur into the front edge here. After the hand stitching was done, the hat was done, which means the whole costume is done. That is how I made my Anna from Frozen costume for a movie that I don't particularly like that much. I know, I'm sorry, everyone loves Frozen, it's not my thing. I do, however, love Anna's costumes, and so I had a lot of fun recreating this as an adult size costume, because I'm sure you've all seen the kids version I made last year. I love all the little detail she has in it, and making all that embroidery was so much fun. Which, speaking of, if you want the embroidery files for your own costume, I have them available for free over on my website, which I will link down below. Feel free to use them. Send me a link if you do. I love seeing people's creations based on things that I have done or given you. Having said all of that though, I probably will do more Anna costumes in the future because my friend absolutely loves Frozen, and it's so much fun getting to dress up and match with your friends. Now don't quote me on this, but there's a solid chance I might do the Frozen Fever dress next, so look out for that one in the future. Anyway, let me know what you guys thought of this down below in the comment section. I love hearing from you guys, and if you liked it, perhaps leave a like. If you really liked it, maybe even consider subscribing. I do a lot of sewing, crafting and fun related things here on this channel, and I'm trying to upload a lot more frequently. With all that being said, I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye!